Good morning, all those of you who joined us today. It's nice to have you with us.
Ja, auch von mir herzlich willkommen. Ich weiß nicht, ich glaube, wir warten noch einen kleinen Moment. Es sind noch nicht alle Teilnehmer dabei. Also noch einen kleinen Moment. Wir sind schon live, und gleich geht's los. Ich würde sagen, wir warten vielleicht noch eine Minute. Andrew, I think we wait one more minute and then we can start.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, let's start. Let's go ahead. Also zunächst einmal recht herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie sich heute Morgen die Zeit nehmen, an dem Webinar The Future of Open Science teilzunehmen, was von der Royal Society in Zusammenarbeit mit Accucoms und Enago organisiert wurde. Es ist mir eine große Freude, Sie heute als Moderatorin durch dieses Webinar zu begleiten. Und ich möchte Sie nur kurz darauf hinweisen, dass dieses Webinar aufgenommen wird und wir Ihnen den Link im Anschluss zuschicken werden. Mein Name ist Ulrike Wiechern und in meiner Rolle als Regional Manager bei Accucoms bin ich Ihre Ansprechpartnerin für Deutschland, Österreich und der deutschsprachigen Schweiz in Bezug auf alle Belange rund um die Royal Society. Ganz kurz für die Leute, die Accucoms vielleicht noch nicht kennen. Accucoms ist die Verlagsvertretung für die Royal Society in Europa und in der Dachregion. Durch die anschließende Präsentation wird sie Andrew Dunn führen. Andrew ist Senior Publishing Editor des Journals Open Science bei der Royal Society und er wird Ihnen heute Einblicke geben, wie die Zukunft der offenen Wissenschaft aus Sicht der Royal Society aussieht. Ganz kurz noch, bevor ich an Andrew übergebe, möchte ich noch kurz zur Erinnerung und für diejenigen, die mit der Royal Society vielleicht noch nicht so vertraut sind, ein paar Worte über diese Gesellschaft sagen. Die Royal Society wurde 1660 gegründet und ist die älteste unabhängige wissenschaftliche Akademie der Welt. Man kann die Royal Society sicherlich als Analogon zu der Nationalen Akademie der Wissenschaften Leopoldina hier in Deutschland sehen. Die Royal Society vereint viele der weltweit bedeutendsten Wissenschaftler aus allen Bereichen der Wissenschaft, Technologie und des Ingenieurwesens und der Medizin. Zu den Fellows gehörten Persönlichkeiten wie Newton, Einstein, Hawking und in jüngster Zeit Persönlichkeiten wie die Nobelpreisträgerin Jennifer Doudna. Die Mission der Gesellschaft ist es, Exzellenz in der Wissenschaft anzuerkennen, zu fördern und zu unterstützen. Und sie erfüllt diese Mission auf verschiedener Weise, zum Beispiel durch wissenschaftliche Tagungen oder öffentliche Veranstaltungen, Webinars wie das heute, die Vergabe von Stipendien und durch ihre Zeitschriften, von denen einige seit 1660 kontinuierlich veröffentlicht wurde. Bevor ich nun noch an Andrew übergebe, noch ein weiterer Hinweis. Wenn Sie Fragen haben, können Sie die rechts in dem Panel, das Sie sehen, eingeben. Die Präsentation wird zwar in Englisch abgehalten, aber Sie können Ihre Fragen gerne in Deutsch schreiben und ich werde es dann übersetzen. Wir sammeln die Fragen und am Ende werden wir diese Fragen dann beantworten. So, und jetzt übergebe ich gerne an Andrew. Andrew, please go.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you for that introduction, some of which I followed. So thank you very much for that. Yes, so as Ulrika said, I'm the publishing editor for the Royal Society Open Science Journal, published by the Royal Society. And indeed, similarly, I'm going to give an overview today of 3 broad things in this presentation, if I can persuade the presentation to work, of course. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of definitions, what we mean by open science to start with, to set some of the context. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how COVID over the last couple of years has affected open science activities in the sort of publishing landscape and the wider scientific landscape. And then finally talk a little bit about the possible future directions of travel as we perhaps see them from this side. I think before I get too carried away in the presentation, a couple of bits of perhaps housekeeping I think might be worth mentioning. One, we'll work out a way of getting these slides to you in due course. So feel free to take any screenshots, take any notes you might like, but don't worry too much about that. We'll make sure you have a copy of the slides later. And secondly, I'm conscious that I have been known to speak quite quickly while giving presentations. So if I do speak a little more quickly than is comfortable, please do post it in the chat, and I'll try and keep an eye on that to ensure that you can let me know if I'm speaking too quickly. So without further ado then, and I'm saying I do hope you can see my screen, and if you can't, do let me know. What is open science then? First things first. Well, I think, as the slide suggests, really, depending upon whom and who you ask, open science can encompass a variety of things. It's both something of a philosophical movement and also has a range of practical applications and kind of practical activities that people can become involved with. Kind of at its root, though, I think what open science encompasses is an advocacy for more open scientific practices, as the name perhaps suggests, that will encourage quicker sharing of research, sharing of research that is better, in inverted commas, have a higher qualitative standard, and has greater veracity and is easy to replicate. So open science can include things like innovations such as preprint servers, which is a good way of perhaps speeding up research, open data, open access publications, and so on. So I'm sure, and just looking at the poll results that are popping in here, I can see that many of you are already quite familiar with a lot of these things we're going to talk about today. So that's excellent. Makes my life a little bit easier, hopefully. But I thought I'd sort of start with a quick refresher of some of these kind of key aspects and then go from there. So open access, the first thing to talk about, and perhaps where kind of open science is most commonly found. As the slide here notes, that many funders of research, particularly those funders who are supported by the public purse, so UKRI in the United Kingdom, for instance, or the NIH in the United States, for example, increasingly require that the research they fund is made publicly available through open access publishing. And there are many different models of open access publishing, but I'm going to focus on particularly 2, but a third one to throw into the mix as I've not included on the slide. And those are, in no particular order, the diamond or platinum route of open access, in which there are no charges anywhere in the system. So I suppose first principles first, before I get too carried away with definitions. For those who perhaps aren't so familiar with open access publication, in effect, what that means is that potentially for a charge, potentially not for a charge, an author's work will be made freely available at the point of publication for anyone to read, anyone with an internet access at least to read. And that model then is supported by a number of ways. So coming back to the diamond and platinum approach mentioned a moment ago. Oh, I've been asked to speak more slowly. My apologies. I'll try to rein it in. Please do keep that feedback coming in. So diamond or platinum open access then. not only allows readers free access to content at the point of publication, but there is very rarely or should not be a charge for authors to publish their work in the form of Diamond or Platinum open access. Advantage there, of course, means that there are no charges in the system for the users of the service, of publishers, of the journals, or from an author's point of view or a reader's point of view. But there are perhaps questions about the sustainability of Diamond or Platinum open access. There is, after all, no such thing as a free lunch. So unless a charitable foundation perhaps is funding that open access, it's a little unclear how sustainable that will be over the longer term. Gold open access is great for readers. Again, content is free for everyone to read. The content can be generally reused quite widely. There are very few restrictions on reuse. Copyrights held by the authors, not the publisher, but there is generally a charge for publication. Now, I'll talk a bit about where that charge comes from later in the presentation, but there's usually a charge for publication in gold open access. Green open access is also a free form of open access, but it tends to be a little less free in terms of utility, and is a little more restricted in the way that content can be used by readers or researchers subsequently. And where it differs from gold or diamond particularly is that whereas gold and diamond open access, a publisher will make content available on their website. In the green model, authors are asked to self-archive, perhaps a version of the post-peer review accepted paper that's not yet been typeset. So those are sort of an outline of open access. If I can persuade the presentation to behave, I've tabulated some of the advantages of some of the stakeholders of the sort of research landscape, to authors, readers, and publishers here, and why open access is perhaps a good thing. So I'm not going to go into this in any particular details. I want to make sure that you're hopefully listening to my slightly slower speech now, and also you'll have access, I hope, to these slides later on. At the Royal Society, we've been supporting open access for a considerable amount of time, and we do that in a number of ways. We have 2 fully open access journals, my own journal, Royal Society Open Science, and the Cellular and Molecular Biology journal, Open Biology. Those are both gold open access journals, so a fee is paid at the point of publication by authors for extensive reuse rights and public access to the content. All the other journals published by the Royal Society, and we have a further 8 journals, so 10 in total. Each of the other journals have open access options. You can pay a fee for publication in those journals as well. They are hybrid journals. Of those journals, 4 are what is known as transformative journals. The 4 research journals, excuse me a moment. And those journals, what we mean by transformative in this case is that much of the content at the moment in those journals is behind a subscription paywall, but authors can opt for open access, both green and gold approaches, and progressively we're driving up the open access content in those journals. And when the content reaches 75% in total in those journals, we will flip them to be fully open access publications. To support all those endeavours, we have a couple of what you might describe as prepaid approaches to open access. We have our flagship Read and Publish deals, in which the Royal Society has negotiated with a range of institutions around the planet, including, for example, the Max Planck Digital Library, of which more in a moment. With those institutions, will pay the Royal Society a flat one-off annual fee, and that fee will support not only open access publication in our journals, but also provide readers at those institutions free access to all the contents that publish in the journals. So it's effectively bundling subscription and open access funds into one package of payment. The advantage to that, for our point of view, is and indeed actually for authors' point of view, it reduces administrative costs quite a large extent. Authors don't have to go to their funder to ask for a fund directly to pay, or don't have to pay directly us at the point of publication if they're opting for gold open access. But also institutions' kind of overheads in terms of administrative costs are reduced somewhat as well, in that all the funding comes out of a centralised pot of money. With the Max Planck Digital Library, we have a similar model, which means that, let's check my notes here, that corresponding authors at any Max Planck institution are eligible to publish open access and for the article processing charge associated with publication to be covered by the library centrally. So again, at the point of contact, authors don't have to worry about finding the funds. It's already been effectively paid for. We also have open access membership schemes, 2 of those, a standard open access membership scheme and also a prepaid version. And in both cases, institutions, libraries will pay the Royal Society a fee, and then authors will have a discounted open access kind of charge in effect at the point of publication. And in the prepay model, the institutions pay the society a credit sum that is then drawn down with each publication from that institution at a discounted rate. So it's kind of a way of trying to spread some of the costs of open access more equitably while encouraging open access publication. But as you will have no doubt picked up on, all of these approaches generally involve some form of money somewhere in the system. And we recognize that not every institution is as fortunate to be able to fund open access directly. So we work with the Research for Life organisation to ensure that researchers and readers at resource-limited institutions, particularly in the developing world, have free access not only to our content, but also have free open access publication as well through that model. So those are a number of ways, in quite lengthy detail, I'm afraid, that we support open access through our society. I won't go into this slide in particularly great depth because I think hopefully you'll have a chance to look at this later, but if you want to know more about open access publication and the open access landscape more generally, the internet is awash with resources. I've picked out 3 example websites here. Our own website that has a lot of information about what we do at the Royal Society in terms of open access, but also more broadly open access material. The OASPA website, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association website, is a coalition of scholarly publishers who do things with open access, and they have again, a wide range of resources that are well worth a look. And then slightly out of left field, I've included a link to the Open Access Week website as well. So Open Access Week takes place on an annual basis in about the third week of October rather, and stakeholders from across the ecosystem come together to explore aspects of open access publishing, and each year as a theme to try to encourage debate and discussion and so on. I think last year it was something to the effect of building structural equity in the open access publishing landscape. So it's quite interesting and quite a fun thing to be involved with. And again, sort of the historical themes can be found at the website. So having talked about open science, I'm going to talk a little bit about open data. I'm going to try and pick up the pace a little bit, if that's okay, because I'm conscious that time is moving on in the way it does. But I thought to talk about open data a little bit. This is again the key feature of the open science movement. So it's all very good perhaps publishing research in a closed fashion and not making data sets available, but it makes it that much harder to verify work that's published. It also makes it harder for academics perhaps to preserve their scientific contributions and claim credit for work they've done that isn't necessarily published in a journal. So the open data aspect of this generally means that a publisher or a preprint perhaps will require an author or an author group to make either a submission or publication the supporting data that is being used to support the conclusions in their manuscript. Now, data in this context can be not just raw or processed data files, perhaps CSV files, but also anything else that is being deployed to support the study. So code or algorithms, R packages, for instance. Biometric data, if you're thinking about paleontology, for instance, perhaps measurements of CT scans and the like, or photographs of fossils, or indeed details about provenance of fossils, if we're talking about paleontology, where the material comes from, where it can be accessed in museums, museum collections, for instance. But why should people make data available? Well, for example, reasons here. Not only can it, I think particularly from my point of view, the one that's most important perhaps is the verification of results and allowing kind of replicability and reproducibility, improving the quality of research, allowing readers to sort of see the journey through the data, as it were, of published research. But also, it's another thing that research can claim credit for doing. A lot of the work that academics do, as I'm sure you're very much aware, is kind of less well rewarded perhaps than it should be, or less well recognized perhaps than it should be by the research ecosystem, and this is another way of supporting that. But again, it's all very well as sort of saying, as a publisher, you must make your data sets available. It's also important, I think, that publishers make it as easy as possible for authors to make data sets available. And indeed, the Royal Society, we've partnered with the Figshare repository and the digital, or dry digital repository rather, to make data sets available. We pay for the data sets to be made accessible for authors. Once again, tabulated some of the advantages for authors, readers, and science in general, which again we can make available later, I hope. Open peer review is a topic close to my heart. We practice it in Royal Society of Open Science. But I think where this is important is that to recognise that for much of the last 100, 150 years or so, a lot of peer review has been something of a black box, carried out in either a double-blind process, where neither reviewers nor authors know who the other are in a paper, or single-blind process in which the authors don't know who's reviewing their paper, but reviewers know who the authors of the paper are. Which meant it's perhaps quite hard to be able to track things like biases in peer review, and it makes it hard for readers, I think, to see sort of the journey of a manuscript from submission to publication, as traditionally peer review histories are kept confidential and hidden behind sort of journals' closed doors. But over the last 25, 30 years, as electronic publishing and the internet have allowed experimentation in peer review, various experiments in open or transparent peer review have been conducted. And open or transparent peer review can mean different things to different people. And then the box on the right-hand side of the screen, which I'm hoping you can see reasonably clearly, and do let me know if you can't. What we generally mean is that the names of peer reviewers or the content of a peer review report are made accessible to at least authors and very generally to readers after publication. So at the Royal Society, we operate a model where most of our journals, I think all of our journals, in fact, operate a single blind review process. So a paper is submitted to a journal, it's assessed by editors and reviewers. The reviewers know who the authors are, authors don't know who the reviewers are, but the output for a number of our journals after publication of the paper, the output of that peer review process, the peer review reports, editorial comments, decision letters, author rebuttals and so on, are published alongside the published manuscript. And we've recently begun to partner with the Publons peer review recognition service to make that process even smoother for authors and readers through their kind of transparent peer review mechanism. So what that means is that all that information is made available with a link to the original paper, but also each kind of segment of that peer review process has a DOI. So reviewers can claim credit for the work they do as a peer review or during the peer review process, because again, the peer review process historically has not been well rewarded. And so by making the peer review process open and allowing reviewers to claim credit for the work they're doing if they wish to do so, we can try to offset some of those historical iniquities. So an overview of open peer review there rather. And again, a tabulation of some of the advantages. In the left-hand column, I've tried to delineate and make clear where the relative value, relative advantage lies for authors or reviewers by square bracketed A or R, as the case may be. And again, with all these tables I've generated, I should say they're not exhaustive lists by any stretch of imagination, but they are perhaps some of the highlights that are pertinent to those aspects of open science. So moving to preprints. Preprint servers are a thing that have been relatively common in some fields, for example, mathematics and physics, for some time. But what effectively they are is a form of hosting service in which an author can deposit a version of their manuscript, an early version perhaps of their manuscript, for kind of quick release, where people can read the content in the public realm. They can receive a degree of credit for early forms of their work, as reputable preprint servers will assign a DOI to preprints, allowing authors to establish precedents and to claim credit for work and ideas in literature. But where it's particularly advantageous, I think, is that many publishers, not all publishers, and I'll come to that in a minute, but many publishers will allow authors to post a version of their paper on a preprint server, for example, arXiv, or which is kind of a mathematical and physical sciences preprint server, or the bioRxiv, which is more of a biological preprint server, as the logo suggests there, or more subject agnostic research. Try again. Research subject agnostic preprint servers such as Research Square, where anybody can kind of post a paper in a particular field, and many publishers allow the preprint to then be submitted to a journal in their portfolio for consideration. And the advantage to authors are, as well as allowing kind of precedents to be established their ideas, there are two additional reasons why it can be helpful. One, it allows a form of kind of peer review, community review of ideas to allow you to hone a paper before submitting to a journal. And very often, an integration with a preprint server and a journal allows a more smooth and a quicker submission process from the preprint server to a publisher's journals. But it is important, I think, to bear in mind that whilst in some fields, deposition of a preprint server is sometimes seen as a form of publication by members of that community, particularly in the UK, for instance. Mathematicians often see arXiv as a form of publication. Some publishers and a number of research assessment bodies and research funders, so particularly in the UK, but not exclusively so, see deposition on a preprint server as a form of pre-publication without extra peer review, and will not, at least the publishers will not allow authors to then submit that preprint to one of their journals for consideration. And although I just said, I realise now that research assessment bodies sometimes see it as pre-publication, what I intended to say was rather the opposite, that in the UK, many research assessment bodies do not see preprints rather as a form of pre-publication and require a pre-printed version of a paper to be peer-reviewed and published in a journal to be allowed to be considered in that research assessment process. So sorry about that, confusing myself there. So it's always worthwhile, if we're considering as an author, considering using a preprint server, make sure you understand what the implications are of doing that for your subsequent, your paper's subsequent career, if you like, whether you can then submit it elsewhere for consideration. So finally, I think in this section, talk a bit about reproducibility. I mean, reproducibility, in a sense, it can be seen as kind of at the heart of what open science can be about, and can bring together some, or indeed probably should bring all together, some of the aspects I've already talked about, from preprint servers through open data, open access, and open peer review approaches. But I want to pick out three aspects of reproducibility, as there are some of which are at least practiced at the Royal Society, but also practiced more broadly, and things that can be, or elements that authors and researchers can bring together to support reproducibility. Firstly, I want to talk about registered reports, which are a form of pre-registered study in which the peer review process of a manuscript of a study is conducted in two phases. The first phase, stage one, allows an author to submit to a journal their proposed hypothesis, their proposed study design, their proposed analytical methods, statistical models, and so on for peer review. The peer review process takes place with looking at that part of a study, a prospective study, and assuming reviewers and editors are satisfied with the proposal, that study, or stage one, is granted what's known as in-principle acceptance, and that is then pre-registered by the authors in a service such as the Open Science Framework provided by the Centre for Open Science. And the authors then go away and conduct their study according to the pre-approved, pre-registered study that they've agreed to through the peer review process and their study design. Once they've collected their data and they perform their analysis as pre-registered, they will submit the stage two, so the completed paper, including their data sets, analysis, discussion, conclusions, and so on, and data sets. To the same journal, the same editors and reviewers hopefully will assess that stage two manuscript. And assuming the authors have conducted the study in the way that they had planned at stage one, as far as the editors and reviewers can determine, that paper will be published regardless of the outcome of the study. So there is a trend in the literature, I think it's fair to say, to prioritize exciting, new, unusual, positive results by journal editors and journal reviewers over good quality science even if that science has not worked as expected. So the advantage of registry reports is it's testing study design and trying to improve study design rather than testing the results per se. And this is to try to abolish or try to tackle some of the biases inherent in literature, things like p-hacking, looking for statistical significance even where it might not be present in a data set, or harking, which is hypothesizing after results are known. So rather than seeing whether your hypothesis was correct that you proposed in stage one, harking is a process in which you fit a hypothesis to the data set you've received or you've generated, which is not necessarily appropriate. So as I say, pre-registration is one mechanism for tackling some of the biases there. Secondly, thinking about replications, moving on to replication studies, ideally, all published work in the literature would be replicated by somebody somewhere at some point, but the reality is that doesn't happen, for, again, partly because the publishing and perish approach and that challenge of people want new work in their journals, not replications. But replication of research is important, to test its veracity and to avoid people making repeated mistakes and so on. As I'm sure you may or may have come across, that something like, I think 30% or so of all papers in psychology in a test about 10 years ago or thereabouts could not be replicated. So the results that were found reported cannot be replicated, which is, if that applies to the rest of the science, that's potentially quite a big problem. So replication is a good way of trying to kind of make science better, and again, conducting that in the round with making data sets available, with peer review accessible and so on, and building in some of the approaches of pre-registration of registered reports to design pre-registered replication studies can be another way of improving reproducibility and replicability. Indeed, the Royal Society, in the form of Royal Society Open Science, allows both registered report and replication studies in the same approach, and we also welcome replication studies without pre-registration as well. And then finally, on this slide, negative outcome studies and negative or null results. As previously alluded to, a lot of science doesn't work. I imagine those on the session today who are academics and have perhaps conducted research and discovered that quite often experiments don't go as planned, and that can be very frustrating, but it's also quite useful. If you don't know what doesn't work, you're doomed to repeat it. And there is definitely an argument to say that a lot of research that is conducted, that results in negative outcomes never sees the light of day, put in the desk drawer and forgotten about. But you think about the amount of money, the amount of effort, the amount of time and heartache that might be saved if negative results were made accessible through a journal, and particularly an open access journal. So it's important, I think, that whilst there are journals, including Royal Society Open Science and others, that are encouraging negative studies, there is perhaps more work to be done here. So there's some aspects of reproducibility. I think I borrowed the logo here from the Centre of Open Science, who do a lot of work in this space, so well worth a look at their websites if you get the chance. So I've done a bit of a survey there of some aspects of open science to date, I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully more quickly, about the impact of COVID on open science, and again, particularly some of the Royal Society's experiences of COVID-19 and open science activities. So the quote here comes from the Royal Society's website, and a summary perhaps of some of the Society's work in the worst kind of early phases of the pandemic in 2020. And one thing it demonstrates quite nicely is the increasing awareness of and interest in open science by the academy and the public more generally. For example, thinking of preprints from an earlier slide, the use of preprints over the last couple of years across the world, but particularly in the Royal Society, has expanded enormously. Two of our journals, Royal Society Open Science and our flagship Life Sciences journal, Proceedings of the Royal Society B, integrated with the bioRxiv preprint server in 2019, which allows authors posting a preprint to bioRxiv to submit much more quickly and seamlessly from bioRxiv to our journals, and driven to a large extent, but not exclusively so, by the integration and by COVID appearing. We've seen a more than 300% increase in submissions between 2019 and the end of 2021 in Royal Society Open Science, and 980% in Proceedings of Royal Society B through that bioRxiv integration. So there's, I think it can be seen there's a hugely growing interest in use of preprints in this space. But I think what's kind of interesting about those preprints is that the decision ratio of accepted or rejected papers from that integration is very much the same as papers received without that integration, which is interesting. I'm not entirely sure I know what it tells us yet, but it's an interesting statistic, and it just, I suppose, suggests that the quality of work received from bioRxiv is as high as kind of ad hoc submissions, which is kind of reassuring, but also there's probably more in that data to parse at some point. But other things that Royal Society did, and other publishers and other entities such as the Wellcome Trust in the UK encouraged, were to try to make COVID results and COVID data and COVID science so on more available more quickly, not just with preprint servers, but we committed to speeding up our peer review process as far as we could for COVID research. And we, in the journal, tried to turn around peer review times for pre-registered studies that with that register report approach within receiving a first decision within 7 days of submission, which is about 3 times as quick, I think, as our kind of regular manuscripts at the time. The value, I think, kind of the key thing with the pre-registration though here, and referring back to the early slide with register reports and being able to design better studies, is given the volume of research and given the potential implications of getting research wrong in inverted commas, drawing the wrong conclusions from research design and so on with COVID, of course, the damage that can do to individuals and societies, the advantage of pre-registering, I think, can be seen immediately in producing better studies that produce better quality results, even if the results don't necessarily provide the answers you want, more effectively. And sometimes I tie to that, we try to ensure that peer review of regular papers was sort of sped up by generating a volunteer network of peer reviewers, and also allowing authors submitting to a selection of journals who'd agreed to participate in a program of porting peer review between journals and porting papers between journals rather. So if a paper was submitted to a Royal Society journal, went through peer review and was rejected, the authors could take that paper and the peer review report and take it to another publisher involved in a rapid reviewing network that had agreed to this, and port those peer review reports across to that other publisher with a view to hopefully speeding up the review process, reducing reviewer fatigue, reducing author fatigue somewhat as well, by minimizing the kind of hoops an author might have to jump through, and hopefully ultimately ending up with a better publication at the end of it as well. So there's some of the things that we did and that were done during so the early phases of COVID. But it will perhaps be of no surprise to you to know that what happened was probably a tip of the iceberg and probably a starting point for what is perhaps needed, and there's going to be more to be done in this space. And so this report in italics and in quotations, Scholarly Communication in Times of Crisis, was prepared by a coalition of publishers who responded to the Wellcome Trust's call to speed up research. And broadly, the recommendations from that were that there had been a lot of positive outcomes, a lot of positive activity in the space of open science, but there's more action required. So encouraging more preprinting, more effective data sharing through services such as Mendeley, Figshare, Dryad, et cetera, that these are sort of underutilized resources at this point. But also making sure that data sets are kind of adhering to things like the FAIR data principles and so on and so forth. There were calls for innovation in peer review experiments, how to make sure that peer review works most effectively and minimizes costs to all parties and things like this. But also perhaps most interesting in some ways is the identification of a need to improve scholarly publishing metadata. So access to citations that are made in a published paper, better tagging and labeling of data sets, particularly with a view to sort of machine reading of data sets. Open access, open abstracts, open indexing of abstracts, and so on. Better metadata about authors, so using things like the ORCID author identification service. So I think what we can see from the last couple of slides that there was a lot done and lots driven by COVID, but there is more to be done. Which leads us very neatly, I think, onto the future of open science. So kind of what's next? Excuse me. So I'm going to draw again, I fear, on what the Royal Society has done in this space. We've been doing a lot for the last 10 years or so in the space of open science. And it's a kind of a useful, I think, starting point for a sort of conversation in many ways. So in 2015, the Royal Society hosted the Future of Scientific Scholarly Communications, the FSSC conference at the Royal Society, which brought together stakeholders from across the sciences, researchers at various stages in careers, funders, academic institutions, learner societies and academies, publishers, technologists, science communicators, industry, kind of the works, really, anybody involved in the publishing landscape. And they came together for a two-day conference to discuss the then state of the art in open science. And this was building on work conducted in 2012 in the Sciences and Open Enterprise report, both of which, all the material of these things are available on the Royal Society's website for free. Excuse me. And well worth a look. And this, I think, what we kind of was basically kind of came from those two kind of large strands of work were these kind of four broad areas, which I've already sort of touched on in earlier slides, that there are four kind of broad areas that need to be perhaps considered to reform the scholarly communication system and make it even more open. And I'm going to talk about these in subsequent slides, but we're looking at greater collaboration between all stakeholders, shifts in research culture, more openness in data, and greater use of preprint servers and post-publication peer review type services. So of those, I'm going to kind of pick four broad areas to have a look at, because I'm sure you can imagine there are many potential directions of travel for lots of these things. But I think that the first point to make is that, and has been referred to earlier really, that where we are now is in quite a good place, but there's more to be done, and we can do it better as a community in terms of open science to make sure that the advances already made are consolidated and that the direction of travel continues towards a more open future. So in terms of data sharing, for instance, there's an argument made that as well as making data available at publication, actually what needs to happen is that data should be mandated to be available during the peer review process. At initial submission, publishers should require authors to make data sets available in some form of publicly accessible repository, ideally with a timestamp so that the data set is not mutable, doesn't change during the review process. I mean, this, and then allowing or encouraging or mandating, really, I suppose, editors and reviewers assess those data sets and code and so on, as well as the paper itself during the review process. Now, because that presents a couple of problems. Firstly, as alluded to in an earlier slide, there's a requirement there to make sure that publishers make it as easy as possible for authors to make data accessible to editors and reviewers, whether that's partnering and integrating with data sharing services like Dryad or Figshare, Mendeley, the OSF, the Open Science Framework, Zenodo, etc. And also providing them resources to allow authors to make those depositions. It feels very, so publishing point of view, it feels quite hard to say to an author, do this thing, and then not provide any support to support that thing. So I think we need to make sure the authors are better supported to do that. We're also going to recognise that if we're asking, we here in the generalised landscape kind of ecosystem point of view, not just publishers, if we require editors and reviewers to access and review data sets and code during the review process, we need to make sure that editors and reviewers have the skill sets and the time to do those things. So again, there's kind of working with different stakeholders to ensure that all parties have the resources, temporal and financial and experiential, I suppose, or in terms of expertise to conduct that peer review of data as well. Also want to be doing things like more pre-registration and making sure that study design is done and peer reviewed more effectively before research is conducted, so that hypothesis-driven research particularly is conducted in a more efficient and effective and valuable way. We're going to want to talk about, I think, look at the peer review system. I mean, setting aside the fact there is a huge amount of literature that is submitted each year and is peer reviewed by a relatively small number of people, and those people are increasingly busy and tired by the volume of research they're having to or being asked to peer review, and there are legitimate questions perhaps about how individuals are rewarded for peer review, as has been kind of alluded to. But there are also kind of practical considerations in terms of the value added by peer review and peer review as the research ecosystem. So there are growing concerns about so-called paper mills, which are a sort of a pay-to-write service that generate, fraudulent manuscripts for authors on an audited basis, and they're submitted for journals for publication. They're quite hard to pick up, but they're not kind of real research, and there's a real risk of the literature being flooded and damaged by paper mills publications. So experiments in peer review to help manage that problem are going to be needed. Some experiments, such as by publishers such as eLife and Faculty 1000 Research, F1000 Research, into forms of collaborative peer review might help there, and might also kind of further open up research. eLife operates a form of sort of collaborative peer review in which editors and reviewers work together to produce a single review document, as opposed to multiple sort of chunks all kind of brought together at the end, with a view to making sure that there's one sort of consensus kind of review that authors are then invited to respond to, which hopefully reduces a little bit some of the work that's required by all parties in that process. And in the open model of F1000 Research, manuscripts are submitted to that service, and following an initial editorial triage, are sort of published in the open, but without further peer review initially. But peer reviewers can be invited to assess that manuscript and provide commentary and kind of a score on that version of a manuscript. Authors can then review it and revise it, and submit a new version of the manuscript with a new DOI, and all these things kind of assigned at DOI, so that the life cycle of that manuscript is kind of almost a perpetual state of revolution, or evolution at least, and multiple versions of the paper can be kind of followed through the review process. There are also similar models, things like the peer community in service, in which preprints are recommended by kind of editors, posted to PCI, and then the peer review process again happens in the open. And after the peer review process is completed, authors can either choose to keep the paper kind of PCI, or they can submit to PCI-friendly publication for further consideration and publication if they wish. And there are also experiments in sort of producing smaller modular bits of manuscript that can be reviewed on a smaller, quicker basis, and then built into bigger papers over time, and so on. There's also many things like tracking, in terms of cultural shifts of research, tracking things like rejected papers between publishers. A lot of research is eventually published anyway, but it might be useful perhaps for the community to consider whether a paper should only have a certain number of strikes, as it were, before it is permanently rejected, not considered anywhere else, which might also tackle things like paper mills and salami slicing of research, perhaps. And also shifting cultures towards, say, publishing fewer, better papers, better study design with better quality data, rather than churning out lots of, I'm sure perfectly fine, but perhaps not particularly useful manuscripts, to reduce the pressure on the system and perhaps reduce costs and time and wasted effort and so on. So there's lots of things that could potentially happen in those kind of spaces. As I'm conscious that time is rapidly running out for me, I'm trying to get through this last couple of slides quite quickly. I think I was already kind of referred to the kind of collaboration and research shifts, or research culture shifts, but I think there's a key thing that we're going to have to think about as a community, is how we all work together better and more collaboratively, from funders to libraries to publishers to authors to reviewers to editors, and indeed readers for that matter. A lot of the changes that have been discussed and perhaps might be recommended will only work if there is support from funders and the infrastructure to make them happen. So working with funders to make sure that the sort of the fiscal resource, the financial resource, but also the technical and logistical support that authors and libraries and publishers need to encourage shifts to a more open environment are going to be essential. And I say moving away from that kind of publish and perish model, I think that prejudice quantity over quality will hopefully be driven somewhat, moving away from that at least, by more collaborative work between funders and publishers and authors and so on. It's also important that we need to do more to recognise the work that editors and peer reviewers do to support the landscape, making sure that individual peer review reports are citable in research and assessments or in CVs and resumes, so that people can cite the peer review work they do, and the editorial work they do, as well as the teaching work they do, the publishing work they do, and the grant funding or panelists work they do, and so on. So that researchers and research can be seen more holistically rather than looking at single impact factor scores of a journal in which someone publishes, and recognizing that the impact factor tells you nothing about the quality of an individual paper, and looking at to tackle that kind of qualitative question of looking at alternative metrics, things like Altmetric, tracking attention scores and so on, and supporting the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, to move away from that impact factor assessment. And I think somewhat taken together, all these things point to a world where authors have a greater control over the work that they're doing, to kind of retain the control of the work and submitting it in the way that they want to submit it, looking at, say, more flexible, more modular chunks of research that can be reviewed more quickly and more effectively than much larger and chunkier papers and so on. And then I suppose finally, we're also looking at kind of how the whole process will be paid for, and I suppose this kind of ties back to what I was saying earlier on, that as things like the Plan S initiative drive change and encourage change with public funders towards more open models of publishing, we're going to see more moves towards the transformative deals and transformative sales deals, such as Read and Publish, that the society has begun to adopt and other publishers are using to move away from pure subscription and hybrid paywall journals towards more open environments. And I think over time, hopefully, these things will drive more open, more open access, more open publications. And as I'm sure you've gathered, I could probably talk about this for a lot longer, but as I'm conscious I've slightly overrun, in fact, I'm going to come to a close there and just point you to the ways you can get in touch with us if you'd like to. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. In fact, you may have heard in the news, a fellow of the Royal Society has recently bought Twitter. I'm sure that'll be quite an interesting experiment over time. And we have a number of journal websites that might be of interest, our top-level journal page, our open access page, and our open science page. And if you have any questions that you can't find the answers to on those things, do get in touch via publishing@royalsociety.org. And I'll stop there, but thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Ich möchte noch ganz kurz ergänzen, bevor wir auf die Fragen kommen. Es gibt ein paar Fragen. There are some questions, Andrew. We will come to it in a moment. Ich wollte nur an dieser Stelle noch ganz kurz hinzufügen. Andrew hatte schon das Max-Planck-Institut erwähnt, wo die Royal Society ein Transformative Agreement hat. Wir haben auch ein Royal Society TIB-Konsortium und Einrichtungen, die diesem Konsortium beigefügt sind, deren Autoren können zu einem reduzierten Preis, haben die ihre APC-Kosten, bekommen sie zu einem reduzierten Preis. Also wenn Interesse an Einrichtungen besteht, diesem Konsortium beizutreten, ist das sicherlich auch eine Möglichkeit. Und ja, alle Autoren, die einem Max-Planck-Institut beigetreten sind, die können eben halt open publizieren ohne APC-Kosten. Ja, dann gehen wir jetzt kurz zu den Fragen über. Andrew, do you see the questions in the question box, or do you want me to read them out to you?
I think if you could read them out, that would be helpful. Thank you. I'm just finding the questions, but if you could read them out, that would probably be very helpful. Thank you.
So the first question is, from the journal perspective, what are some factors influencing the level of information made available for open review? An example, why not make it fully transparent?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. So I think there are perhaps two factors that might be particularly pertinent in response to that. The first is, I suppose, perhaps technical limitations. If there are, depending upon the journal manuscript submission system that's being used, if it's entirely electronic, which I imagine it will be in this today, and whether that service can be effectively integrated in some way with a mechanism on either a journal website or a third party such as Publon's peer review recognition service, to extract effectively the information from the peer review system and post it and host it after publication to I'd say the journal kind of website or the third-party web service. So say the technical aspects possibly. I mean, I think increasing that is a relatively small barrier to entry for publishers, and indeed it's not a huge problem from our point of view. But I think perhaps the more sort of interesting aspect is differences in attitude and culture, I suppose, to openness and peer review from different editorial boards, different authors, different reviewers, and so on. And indeed, in different kind of research subject areas as well. There are some fields that are perhaps a little more comfortable with open peer review or forms of transparent or open peer review than others. But whether that's perhaps driven by experience with things like preprint servers or not is an interesting kind of secondary question, perhaps. But we found at the Royal Society that some editors are very, very keen on openness, and that they think it's a useful thing as a training tool for junior scientists. So if you're posting high quality peer review reports after publication, and indeed there is some evidence to suggest that publishing peer review reports encourages kind of better peer review report writing. That those peer reports in the open can be used for training the next generation of scientists. But there's also perhaps there's a limited suggestion. It's a little harder to demonstrate in some ways, but that perhaps that more junior scientists and authors therefore tend to be more interested in openness and more open peer review, more interested in open peer review than perhaps more established scientists. Sometimes, at least, well, that's because they have grown up in a more open environment with open access and open data, and things like social media, everything is open anyway, is an interesting question. But there are also, just to flip that on its head as well, there are some junior scientists who are more concerned about open peer review because they don't want to be in a situation where their name and reports and comments are associated, if they're being critical of, even if constructively critical, of kind of leading lights, leading figures in their field, if they've been invited to peer review. So it's quite an interesting sort of set of moving parts, that question of what factors are involved. I think it's probably most pertinent to that kind of research culture aspect, and whether editors of a journal are enthused and whether they therefore communicate that enthusiasm to reviewers and authors and readers. Okay. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay, there's another question. I've seen new articles citing preprints and misrepresenting results from publications. How can authors, journals help to safeguard the general public from being misled?
Okay, so that's interesting. So assuming here the particular problem is that journalists like to sell a newspaper or drive attention to their websites and television channels rather than the journals per se. In some ways, I think, again, things like open data, use of preprints, and open peer review can all help tackle that set of problems by making the fullest story of the research available to kind of a reading public, or scientific and sort of lay public, a non-academic public. So that everyone can kind of see what the sort of story of that research is and can identify where the problems might be, and can perhaps see if misrepresentation has taken place. There's also something to be said that publishers generally will have a press office, or many publishers will have a press office. Indeed, the Royal Society has a very effective and very active press office that works quite hard to ensure that when content in our journals is published, it is communicated to scientific to media outlets, various, and that as far as it's possible for them to do, that the correct representation of that research, is made. in the media. But also authors, of course, can do things as well, like making sure that they are what's the word I'm looking for? That they are involved in kind of media training as well. That the Royal Society as an organisation provides opportunities for academics to have media training to work out how to deal with the press, so they can make sure that their story is communicated appropriately and correctly, rather than allowing news services that might be considered less reputable from misrepresenting the scientific story. But also scientists, if they're working with their universities as well, for the press office to kind of try to encourage corrections if needs be in those media outlets, or producing blogs, videos, and so on to kind of, I suppose, make sure the scientists themselves are able to control the story to some extent. But I think it's probably a collaborative effort again, and to some extent, I suppose it's always going to be the problem that a journalist is going to want to drive attention to their services, and a bit of controversy and misrepresentation can be a way of doing that, which is perhaps not a very reassuring answer ultimately, but I think there are things we can do at our side, as referred to, that might help a little bit.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the presentation. Ich möchte mich auch bedanken an all die Teilnehmer. Ich hoffe, Sie haben ein paar Neuigkeiten über Open Science und wo die Reise hingeht erfahren können. Wenn Sie Fragen haben, wie Andrew schon sagte, Sie können sich gerne an die Royal Society direkt wenden. Sie können auch gerne an mich sich richten, und ja, wir kommen gerne auf Ihre Fragen zurück. Ja, dann bleibt mir nur übrig, ja, nochmals Danke zu sagen, dass Sie heute dabei waren, und ja, ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Tag. Okay, bye.